I started on the next Monday morning, and I soon learned that the office girl was a maid of all work. I'd got all the odd jobs and everything to do. I'd never ever used a telephone before, and of course there was a telephone on the wall, you see, and when it rang they said, "You'll have to answer this, come on." And one of the clerks took me to the telephone, you see, and she lifted the receiver off. It was sort of a place for you to speak into, and a receiver that hung on a latch. And she lifted this latch up and put it to my ear, and she said, "They'll ask your number. This is the number up here." And she put the number up, Central 269. The girl said, "What is your number?" And I said, Central 269. "Hold the line," she said, "hold the line." And then she said, "I've got a call for you. It's Mr. Peyton to speak to Mr. Maris." So I turned to this girl and I told her. She said, "Well, you go and knock Mr. Maris's door and tell him that he's wanted on the telephone." And he'd got a telephone on his wall. They weren't desk phones in those days. It was on the wall. And he went and answered, and then I could put the receiver back on in the other office, you see. And I got through that, and I had to slit open all the Morning Post, open all the envelopes, and then I had to open all the parcels that had come in and enter them into an in parcels book, and who they'd come from and what the parcels contained had to go into this book every morning. And then there was a big basket full of filing, and they showed me how to do the filing. And then it was time for me to make the tea for everybody in the office. So I had to go into a little cubbyhole place, kitchen they called it, but it was very, very small. And I made the tea and took it all round to everybody. And then afterwards I had to collect the cups and wash them all up. And in this office there was a great big black fire grate and a huge fire, and I had to keep making the fire up. It was all those sort of jobs that I had. Anyway, I enjoyed it, and I learned a lot in that office. I learned a lot of things. And after about 6 months, they put me onto Invoicing, and they gave me a desk and a typewriter, and they installed a PBX telephone, and they said I could do the telephone and the invoices. And it was sort of on the back of the desk, so that I just had to lean over to attend to the telephone. And I learned to do shipping invoices. The girl who did the shipping invoices left. Well, there wasn't only the shipping invoices, had to be in copies of 6. So you had to use carbon paper in those days. You couldn't copy it like today. Carbon paper in between. 6 copies of the invoice, and I think it was 5 copies of the bills of lading, so that when the railway man came to collect it, you'd got to give him all these. One to go inside the case, in the crate, then he had to have a copy for the railway, and then 2 had to go to the shipping people and 1 to keep in the office. So it was quite a big job, because if you happened to make an error in the invoice, if you just happened to put a 5 down instead of a 3, then you'd got to rub the 5 out, and you had to go all through these carbon papers, and it was really messy and hard work, really. I met my friend that I'd had in a commercial college, and she'd got herself a job as well. And she was amazed when I said I was going to have 15 shillings a week, because they'd only offered her 10 shillings. 10 shillings a week was all she was going to get, and she could do shorthand the same as me, you see. And she said, "Have you done any shorthand?" And I said, "No, it doesn't look as if I'll ever do any, not here anyway." And she eventually got a typist job at the place where she was working, but I could see that I would never get that, because they'd already got a shorthand typist doing all the letters. And I decided to leave, and they'd given me a ½ a crown increase in 2 years, which my mother said wasn't enough. She thought that was a bit poor, 2 years and only get ½ a crown increase. So I decided to look for another job, and I went to work in Kings Norton at a place called the Worcester Brass Company. They made brass hinges. I went as an invoice clerk, of course, to start with, and then after about 7 or 8 months, I became secretary to the managing director. So my shorthand was very, very useful. And I can remember going back to the old office to see the girls. And, they were pleased to see me. And they said, "Oh, it's been terrible ever since you went. It's been awful." And I said, "What do you mean awful?" She said, "Oh, those shipping invoices," she said. "Twice we missed the boat." She said, "You can imagine Mr. Madis's rage. Twice we missed it." She said, "And the new girl has took over the PBX, cut the boss off twice." She said, "Something you never done." So I said, "Oh dear," she said, and he came in the office here raving, and he said, "I don't know what's the matter with you girls," he said. "Ever since Miss Mills left," he said, "you seem to have got to pieces. It seems to me," he said, "that she was carrying the office." Mind you, I did work hard there. But anyway, I was a private secretary by the time I was nearly 19. Which pleased me very much because that was really what I wanted to do. And then in 1928 I changed my job again, and I went to work at Henry Wiggin as secretary to the manager of the chemical department. That was very interesting work, and when I was having the interview, it was the chemical works were at Smethwick. And, it was a big, barren-looking sort of a place. When I went in to go for the interview, I thought what a dreadful place it was. And the office was an old cottage, farm cottage, and farmhouse, really. And it was very hard to imagine that not so very many years before that, it had been agricultural land, and there was a canal basin that came nearly to the office that I could see from my office window. You could see the barges of coal coming down the canal. But when I went for the interview, quite casually, this Mr. Priddy said, "I hope you won't mind being the only girl here." So I said, "Oh no, I thought he meant in that office, you see." And it wasn't until I'd been there nearly a week that I realised I was the only girl there on the whole ground. So I was the only female on the whole ground. But they were all very kind and very good to me, really. I had a very interesting 11 years there. And then they moved the whole chemical works to South Wales, and I'd fell in love with one of the chemists in the laboratory, you see, and we got married, and I went to live down in Clydach up the Swansea Valley, where they'd moved the chemical department down to there. And this was 1938 they began moving the factory, and they completed it at the beginning of 1939. And then Don and I got married, and I went to live in Clydach, although I didn't go to work there at all. They didn't employ women at the Modern Nickel Company, only men. They were all men typists and everybody. There were only just 1 or 2 women in the canteen. It wasn't until the war started in September 39 and the men began to go to the war that they started employing women. But I didn't go to work because, married women didn't work in those days anyway, not until the war came and they were conscripted, a lot of them.